Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to Dr. Michael Rossi, a lecturer at Rutgers University and visiting professor at Fordham University, Pace University, as well as Webster Uni in Tashkent. Michael teaches political science and international relations, and he is the host of the YouTube channel Michael Rossi Pol Sci, on which he publishes very valuable primary sources, mainly of Russian speeches and interviews. He just a few hours ago uploaded a very interesting presentation by Vladimir Putin that he gave in China, a press conference at the end of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting and general meeting of 4 days in China. So these kind of sources are always very valuable to listen to in their original tone, as Michael also doesn't dub them but subtitles them. I highly recommend checking out his channels. Michael, welcome back.
Pascal, always good to speak with you. Thank you very much for having me back on your channel.
Thank you for coming back online, because there are so many things happened in the past, let's say, 2 months in terms of great power politics in meetings, and of course, most recently, the SCO meeting. And we probably should talk about this a little bit, what it tells you about the direction of world politics. Can you maybe give me your impression of this succession of meetings, high-level meetings, including Washington, including Anchorage, and now China?
I mean, we are in such a unique era, Pascal. I was going to, originally comment on just the Shanghai cooperation, but you had asked me to extend this to the Anchorage summit, the resumption of talks between Russia and the United States. I mean, if there is any doubt whatsoever that we are in the unipolar era, I would love to hear counter arguments to the contrary.
You meant multipolar, right?
Multipolar, yes. What did I say?
Unipolar.
Oh, I'm sorry, but let me rephrase that once again. If there is any doubt that we are in the multipolar world at this point, I would love to hear arguments to the contrary. Yes, absolutely. The only people that will probably argue that we are still in a unipolar world are American analysts that still want you desperately to believe that we're in the 1990s, or those that will disregard the SCO or any subsidiary meetings like BRICS or what else? The Eurasian Economic Union as just, nothing more than just attempts at trying to counterbalance that of the European Union, NATO, or the Transatlantic Alliance.
It's good that you're also mentioning these other initiatives, because the multipolar world is not just BRICS or not just the SCO, right? It's the combination of all of those fora, plus the fact that it's not anymore the decision of any little group of states that then determines the way forward. To your mind, what are now the pillars that we are seeing emerging upon which the multipolar world rests?
So, the prevailing assessment within the IR field, the international relations field, and any IR scholar that's worth their weight in salt will tell you this, whether it's John Mearsheimer, Stephen Walt, Glenn Deason, Nikolai Petro, if nothing else, even myself, will say that the world today is not dominated. I want to say not dominated, and neither controlled, but led by a number of regional powers, of which we can, unarguably include the United States. Is still a major power, although they are the one power that does not really want to be included in the larger group of multipolar powers. Along that, we would have Russia and China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Iran, South Africa. I'm just including countries now that are influential. I don't think anybody will really doubt the global influence of countries like China or Russia. But countries like India, for sure, Indonesia, Iran, South Africa, Brazil, even Turkey, for that matter. And the important thing to note, Pascal, about all of this is that the SCO summit that just concluded in China is not, in the words of Narendra Modi, it's not anti-Western. It's just simply non-Western. But it's not inherently an organization that would exclude the West, the US, the UK, or others. It's, from what I have gathered, a number of countries that have just simply decided that they are going to coordinate and cooperate along a number of multilateral economic, political, social, cultural axioms, regardless of whether or not the West wants to be involved or not. And I have to also add one other thing. Over the last couple of weeks, we have seen a number of major international summits and conferences. The US-Russian meeting in Anchorage. We've talked about the follow-up meeting about Ukraine's security and sovereignty with those in the EU that claim to still speak on, its behalf. And if I can get a little bit more personal as far as our viewers are concerned, right? Many of our viewers come from Europe. They come from the United States. They come from North America. Our viewers are not necessarily anti-Western, but I would like to think that most of our viewers, our subscribers, are a bit critical of the type of neoliberal and neoconservative approach to the world that still predicates the idea that the West is best and the rest either follows and is, a partner, or doesn't and is considered to be a rival. And this is becoming an outdated narrative, in my opinion. I think one of the big things that we can take away in the last couple of weeks are really two things. Number one, the so-called rest, and this is just a very general collection of non-Western countries, is not really waiting for the Western alliances to re-invite them back into the community of nations, but they are doing their own things. They're creating their own cooperative ventures. They're forming their own, future prospects outside of the West. And the second thing is that the leaders of the European Union appear to be more reactionary than progressive. I don't see them as leaders. I just see them as responding to what has already been largely decided between either Trump and Putin or the rest of the emerging world, over how the future 21st century is going to look.
I completely agree with your assessment here. The question to my mind is whether this is a new phenomenon or if we are seeing now the fruition of something that has been going on for a long time. It's 2025 now, and it's the 70th anniversary of the Bandung conference. And to me, Bandung is really a watershed moment where for the first time ever you had a meeting of states that were non-European, right? And in the end, I count North America as transatlantic kind of European because the majority of the politics is dominated by people who are just the descendants of emigres, right?
Exactly.
Of people who then genocided the North American continent, right? And replaced it, and there we go. Now. Then we had 600 years. Overall, we had 600 years of Euro-American dominance of the entire globe. And 70 years ago, we saw how they started changing, but it changed very, very slowly. And neo-colonialism during the Cold War was a real thing. And, poaching people in Indonesia and in all, basically, every single South American country, in every African country, having direct neo-colonial dominance over the infrastructure and the economy, and in East Asia and in Southeast Asia, of course, then having a huge, large war in order to reassert dominance under the guise of we have to fight communism, which in the end turns out 50 years later, 60 years later, the US presidents are more than happy of striking any kind of deals with the North Vietnamese, with the communist Vietnamese, and with the communist Chinese. So it shines an entirely new light on the way that the Cold War, also what the Cold War was fought about. So question now is, why is it that now these states, non-European, non-transatlantic states, are able to assert themselves much more and create a reality which really makes the old dominant group reactionary? Were like during the Cold War, I think they weren't. That was a different dynamic.
Oh, I mean, just this question alone will elicit a 45-minute response. This is more of an academic lecture than anything else. The very short answer to this is, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the world that globalization in the 1990s produced. Welcome to this world. Welcome to the multipolar world. Welcome to the post-unipolar world. Where do I even begin? There's so many things to look at here. From the perspective of the developing world, the global south, whatever it is that we want to call it, we use a lot of terms. The rest, the global south, the developing world, the emerging periphery, there's just, they all kind of say the same thing. But you're absolutely right on the idea that this is largely the non-Western world, right? The major participants in the Shanghai Cooperation Summit that just concluded, with the exception of heads of state of two European countries, Slovakia and Serbia, both of whom are regarded by the EU as pariah states, as potential problem states, right? And this, I'm not getting into, and I will not, defend the politics or the policies of Robert Fico or Alexander Vucic. They are, they are who they are, but they did attend, right? They were in Shanghai, and they were largely, observer, members to the larger countries like Russia, China, India, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Iran, Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the like. What we see when I say the products of globalization is that the world following the end of the Cold War effectively said that the world can and should develop through mechanisms of market capitalism, industrialization, modernization, consumerism, and digitization. This is exactly what these countries have done. China, India, Russia, Indonesia, at least the top four countries, to give a few. And yet they have all modernized while not westernizing. And I'm also not one, and I've been in academia now for 25 years. I am not one to openly recommend nor promote Sam Huntington's work, The Clash of Civilizations, but I'm pretty certain that all of, a good number of our viewers are familiar with this work. But I recommend to as many people as possible to either reread the book or pick up the book for the first time. Because what Huntington had said about 30 years ago is playing out to be pretty true today. And that is, non-Western states will modernize, they will industrialize, and they will become major influencers in a new multipolar global arena, but they will not democratize. They will not adopt the policies of liberal democracy that the West thinks is coterminous with capitalistic development. And so the number of countries that we see attending the SCO summit, along with the core members, participants, new members that wish to join, it's not surprising that many in the West look at them and see them as an association of autocracies, dictatorships, non-democracies. But none of these states are poor. right? None of them are failing states. They are all on the developing level. And so what we have noticed in the last 25 to 30 years is that states can develop through the mechanisms of corporatist capitalism without adopting policies of liberal democracy and provide a certain quality of life for their citizens that many people, and look, you know me, I mean, I have lived in Uzbekistan for 3 to 4 years. Um, it is, at least from the Western standpoints, not, a liberal democracy. It is very much, I would say, more so a top-down corporatist entity. But, whether it's Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, one can live quite well. I mean, the free market is there, consumerism is there, the quality of life is certainly improving. And this is something that I think many in the West have a hard time trying to come to grips with. And that is, can one live in what is comparatively a non-liberal democratic state and still live very, very good? I'm here to tell you that many people can. And many within the, SCO, of which Uzbekistan, I have to say, is one of the original members of, is a country that is focusing more, right, on consumerism and economic modernity instead of this notion of liberal democracy. And so I guess at this point, what we realize is that, the SCO meeting, that summit that concluded in 2025, really culminates more than anything else as the hour of China. China comes out of this as the main victor, as the main proponent of an alternative model to that of which the West, the United States, the European Union, is providing.
Yeah.
And this is something that we can and should really, really dissect over the next, half hour or so.
No, yeah, that's a very good point that you're making. And when you say liberal democracy, I think what we need to understand with that is the Western model of doing politics and having a certain couple of principles which they sometimes live up to and sometimes not, but they at least proclaim those principles. And what we're seeing is maybe that the one thing that's coming out of the Cold War is that a majority, basically almost all states, have accepted market economy works, but we are not drinking, or we're not taking the neoliberal Kool-Aid of then also connecting that with capitalism. Because I mean, let's face it, the United States and parts of Europe, good parts of Europe, are very, very captured as well, right, by corporate interests and by capital interests. Whereas in places like China, you definitely have market forces, but you do not have the influence of money in the form of lobbying over the political process. You do have other forces that govern political decision making. We've seen how over the last 25 years, a major part of Vladimir Putin's work was actually to undo the liberalization and the power of oligarchs over the system. Not all and not entirely, but we've seen an undoing of that part of the neoliberal agenda. But the recognition is there that no, market forces do work. I mean, in the video that you just translated with Vladimir Putin, he actually said the pricing of the oil that's going to come through the pipeline through Mongolia to China is going to be based on market principles and so on. He went out of his way to say, like, look, this is going to play according to those rules, which apparently the global South and everybody is now agreeing to. Like, we're going to build upon those because they create prosperity. So the West, in a sense, has to come to grips with the fact that something of what they've been sticking to is working, and other things are completely not working for the rest. But the rest is not taking orders anymore. The most it's taking is examples, right? In order to say, like, yeah, what does and doesn't work to bring economic prosperity. So in a sense, we're now in a place where a lot of countries have learned those very hard lessons that if you take everything that comes from the West, you land in neocolonialism and you land in the IMF debt trap, and you will be poor for the next 50, 60 years to come. So you gotta create your own mix of stuff that works for you, just as Singapore did very early on, and China is now a mega Singapore that kind of proves the point.
This is the crux of the matter, and let's really boil down this notion of how effective is market capitalism to its bare bones,
Mm.
because what you bring up is very, very important, and that is the idea that market capitalism can certainly bring prosperity. It can improve the quality of life of many people. But the difference between the West and the non-West is whether market capitalism is in the hands of private enterprise or in the hands of the state. And this is ultimately what we are looking at. If we really want to figure out if there is a battle of ideology in the present period, we look at the Cold War, and it was a battle between Marxist socialism and free market capitalism. Where we are today is ultimately deregulated, privatized neoliberal capitalism in the West, or effectively this type of corporatist capitalism that the Chinese government has modeled and exported to the world. Because in the Chinese model, and I'm not saying that this is the be-all, end-all model, but it is the model that is in the ascendancy for much of the developing world. And that is the market is there, but it is regulated by the state. This is the big difference between Russia, China, BRICS, SCO, and that of the neoliberal West. You do not see in the non-Western world the equivalent of Elon Musk's, of Bill Gates's, of Jeff Bezos's, of Koch brothers. You don't see these. Within the non-Western world, if there are economic technocrats, they are not only part of the state, they are party members of that state. This is not to say that this is superior to that of the West, but at the moment that we are having this discussion right here, right now, the emerging countries that are looking more and more like they will, if not dominate the global market, certainly have a major influence on them, are doing so through state bureaucratic regulations. This is ultimately why Russia is so much in tandem with what is going on with economic policies with China and with the rest of BRICS. It's this idea that the market can certainly provide improvements to the quality of life of many people. Russia, China, Indonesia, India, Brazil, among others, is that market success should have some kind of benefit, some reward for the collective whole, not just those that have the libertized market and sort of the state-controlled market within the non-Western world. It's going to be interesting to see if this ultimately is an alternative form of capitalism that challenges, that of the West. Because what we don't see, right, what we don't see in many of these countries are the Russian, Chinese, Indian, Indonesian, Iranian, Brazilian equivalents of Jeff Bezos, of Elon Musk, of even George Soros or Richard Branson or any of these other individuals, right? In the West, we have these market gurus that are not connected politically to anything. They're just simply the market. They're connected to politics, but they end up influencing politics. Within the non-Western world, take it as you are. I'm not saying that I'm promoting this, nor am I criticizing this, but it's just an alternative model, is that would-be equivalents to these individuals are members of the state bureaucracy, and are interested in at least trying to provide some kind of social welfare for the vast majority of their citizens. And I think this is ultimately what we are going to see moving forward in sort of one or two ideological differences between the West and the non-West.
Yeah, one of the things that we're seeing definitely in non-European, non-North American societies is that you do have a strong emphasis on, especially in Asia, on delivering prosperity, right? And that also goes for Russia, right? You need the point of the state is to make sure that you have a good number of people having a decent life and having improvements in life. And we've seen how that spirit basically has been lost in Europe and North America because the emphasis is all on we are a good democracies. Therefore, it doesn't matter if people like fall behind and if this generation has a lower income and prosperity than the previous generation, because at the end of the day, we're still democracies. And this kind of rhetoric to me is very hurtful to the entire social fabric, whereas other parts have realized, look, it's prosperity. We need to generate prosperity. Um,
No, you're right.
and what this has landed us now in a situation where I do believe that we see this tremendous amount of hubris from the West. Tremendous, because the speech act is what to cling to if you cannot
Yeah.
deliver anymore, and it is a system that doesn't deliver anymore. Used to, but can't do it anymore. The multipolar world then is one in which you have large economies that actually work in one way or another. And that, I mean, Europe and North America are completely doomed. They still have very important economic advantages helping them, but they're constantly sabotaging their own potential, whereas the others are trying to multiply their potentials and actually by also working together. Is this a phenomenon of this decade or these decades now? And how do you see it play out over the long term?
Yeah, this is a fantastic, fantastic question. Thank you for bringing this up, Pascal, because, again, you and I are both from the West. We both largely see eye to eye on this. In continuing to quote Huntington, but not from his Clash of Civilizations, but from an earlier work that he wrote about. Um, b- there were two earlier works that I should point out. The first was one that he had written in the 1960s called Political Order in Changing Societies. This is something that is much more known to academics than to the general public. And then he wrote another work in the early 90s called The Third Wave, which was him looking at the way in which countries of Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, Latin America have transitioned to democracy. So let me take this in bit by bit to address your question. One thing that we can look at for many of the countries of Shanghai cooperation is that they are, at the absolute best, not liberal democracies. Some of them may be autocracies, some of them may be illiberal democracies, but they are not liberal democracies in the North American European sense. But they are largely countries that are conscious enough to understand that economic prosperity, the improvement in the quality of life, is important to its citizens. If nothing else, mentions this in both Political Order and in Third Wave by using a term called performance legitimacy. Right? Let me repeat that. Performance legitimacy. It's an ingenious strategy in which autocratic governments recognize that to keep the population happy, compliant, they need to focus on economic development, the improvement in consumerism, the investment in industrialization and digitization, to the point where a growing middle class can live in countries like China, Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Mongolia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Egypt. You get the idea, right? where politics is still monopolized by a group of leaders at the top. But rather than constantly criticizing and protesting this oligarchy, the leaders provide a fluid and flexible environment in which one can get rich, can improve, can become middle class, can own property, can go on vacation, can get the latest thing, can use all the social medias like any other consumeristic society in the West. And the big question is, can a non-democratic society live and function and grow prosperously in the absence of liberal democracy as long as there is some investment in economic development? And I think what countries like China and Russia and others have shown is that, yes, they can. That doesn't mean that democracy is irrelevant. Don't get me wrong. Do not get me wrong. It does not mean that democracy is irrelevant. But what it does mean is that the emerging middle class, if they feel that they are not oppressed, if they're not ideologically indoctrinated, but if they feel that the world is, pretty much the same, and they also understand that many of the Western countries that proclaim to be paragons of liberal democracy are utilizing a type of privatized capitalism that juxtaposes the super rich at the absolute expense of the exploited underworld, and at the same time proclaims to speak out on behalf of international law, human rights, universal principles, while turning blind eye and deaf ear to crimes against humanity in places like the Middle East and elsewhere. Then many of the citizens of these emerging countries are going to look at the advertisement of liberal democracy and say, what does it ultimately mean? It's really nothing, in that sense. So, in that regard, I think that where we are going at this point in 2025 is that the dividing line between democracies and non-democracies is no longer black and white. It's no longer, democracy, in the classic political science sense. It's no longer a sense that democracies are prosperous countries, authoritarian states are poor countries. No. Prosperous countries can be democracies or non-democracies. And this is something that many people, it doesn't necessarily mean that the upcoming generation is non-democratic or anti-democratic, but they tend to think of what democracy ultimately is something that the West no longer has a monopoly as far as its narrative and its philosophical morals.
Yeah. So maybe what we got wrong in the West was to believe that democracy, that this political vehicle that we constructed to some part, that has existed in other places before, right? But that we kind of championed that is the incarnation of a value that is actually much higher, or in a sense more profound, than how we deliver it. And maybe that value is rather something like, let's say, fairness. If people perceive that their societies are fair and that they have fair chances to make it in the society, and that society rewards them with what they should receive, then they don't care who runs the show, as long as they perceive that it works. And democracy is, of course, a vehicle to try to deliver that, to deliver fairness. So fairness in the sense also of social mobility, but also of political say and having being integrated. And we see how in the West we have very different democracies. I would never ever try to compare the democracy of Switzerland with that of the United States, because they function very differently. They have different mechanisms of political participation. And in the same sense, you have very different ways of political participation and social participation in China and in Singapore and in Japan. But if it delivers and people are content with what's going on, then, well, there you go, right? You've got yourself a functioning system.
And there is effectively the definition of performance legitimacy, right? Make the people who matter happy, and they are not going to question the hegemony or the authority of the state. This is the sobering reality of the 21st century. You're absolutely correct on that, right? And look, the quality of life grows in Central Asia, in the in certain countries in Africa, in Southern and Southeast Asia. The quality of life grows. Consumerism is there. There's no overt ideology that is dominating how and what people think. So the ordinary citizen realizes I can make money, I can live my own life, I can mind my own business, I can buy my house, I can, buy a car, I can have a family, I can live good. I can live good. If that is enough, you are not going to bite the hand of the state that effectively allows that, which is basically what Huntington's concept of performance legitimacy is. There is one little caveat. There's one little caveat in this, and that is if the state remains autocratic, every so often, the public is going to expect more from that state, right? When states provide some kinds of reforms, they roll back restrictions, they allow certain social media platforms to be used. Like, beforehand, Twitter was banned. Now you can use Twitter. Before, Instagram, YouTube was banned. Now you can use YouTube. Once you provide these, luxuries, it's very risky to take them away. But within every 5 to 10 years, the quality of life becomes more expensive. So the public demands more. Now, the states that in question can provide more and more reforms, but at some point, the state is going to reach a point where, and this is Huntington saying this, not me, but the state will provide a certain level of reforms that at some point almost abrogates, negates any notion of political monopoly. At some point, people are going to think to themselves, I should not just simply take whatever the state tells me, but I should be able to question the state. I should be able to challenge the state, hence the notion of bringing in political pluralism. So even this idea of buying loyalty from a population through economics is at some point going to create a middle class that will enable that class of people to feel like they have a right to, if not challenge the state, but question the state. So it almost is to the point where democracy becomes, I don't want to say inevitable, but it becomes, and this is something that the literature within political science talks about a lot. It's not within public access, but it's almost to this idea that economic reforms are the first stage in facilitating a larger degree of political pluralism, of multi-party debate, if nothing else, right? But what this ultimately tells you is that democracy is ultimately a universal variable. It's not a vocation from the West. And it's not something that the West has to introduce to the non-West, because it's going to happen no matter what. It will take maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years, but it's going to happen. The bigger issue that I want to also mention to all of our viewers is that, when a country like Russia or China or Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Singapore, Mongolia, whatever, a non-Western country, right, eventually evolves into some form of political pluralism, democracy does not invariably mean being pro-Western. It doesn't mean being pro-American. It doesn't mean being pro-European. And I'm sure that many of our collective viewers are smart enough to know that many non-Western countries have decided to kind of go the democratic route, but not play into the pro-Western route, and eventually be subjected to Western intervention involving some form of regime change, that brings in a government that is much more compliant and cooperative with that West.
These are very, very good observations, and we also see how this notion, the Western notion of the world, culminating then in a fight between liberal democracy and autocracy, how that is just a dumb way of seeing the world. I mean, it's just objectively not how it works. We can completely discard it. It's utterly failed. And I cannot keep myself from bringing up the example of Mongolia. Little Mongolia, actually big Mongolia, but small in population size, sandwiched between the two giants of Russia and China, and over the last 30 years, democratizing, textbook democratization, and every other year brings another kind of power sharing and reconfiguring innovation that creates checks and balances and really is a textbook case of democratization and liberalization, not liberalization, but democratization for sure, for sure. And that Mongolia integrates perfectly with its two neighbors, and now we've seen, of
Absolutely.
course, at the SCO, they even managed to get a pipeline through themselves because both of their
Siberia too.
trust them.
Very good. Yes. Yes.
So
Yes.
so it's not
Yes.
a contest of these two systems. The systems could at least Russia and China couldn't care less about the system that Mongolia has, as long as it geopolitically plays along, and it does so perfectly. And the citizenry of Mongolia, I would argue, stands to gain from this cooperation, which stands in contrast to what the Europeans are doing and how they approach these West countries that are not the West.
Yeah. So it's a good thing that you brought up Mongolia because in many of my classes that I teach, comparative politics, democratic transition theory, among others, right? I use the data provided by Freedom House to give a general sense of how countries are perceived: free, partly free, not free. I'm fairly certain that all of our collective viewers, to some degree, are familiar with Freedom House. And I show this map of Asia, and most of the countries are considered to be not free, but yet Mongolia is free, right? Mongolia is considered to be a democracy. And my students are always asking, how does Mongolia somehow manage to make this while they are sandwiched, as you say, between Russia, China, and the rest of Central Asia? So during my time out in Uzbekistan, I had the pleasure of meeting and working with a colleague of mine who is from Mongolia. And I asked him this question, right? Because he's one of the, reigning experts in the, at the university at, Webster about Mongolia. And just, take it for what it is. And I asked him, what is it with Mongolia? How is it a, democracy by comparison? And he says, calm down. Hang on a second, right? Just let me explain things how they are. There's largely two political parties in Mongolia, roughly speaking. One is the former communists that have largely reformed and work within the electoral system. And the other is the, committed Democrats. Now, both are well-established, entrenched political parties that have their clients. They're both corrupt. And whoever is in power has the authority and the ability of basically stealing from the state. But both parties adhere to periodic elections. So at some point, the public gets angry at the incumbent party and votes for the opposition party as a way of getting the incumbent party out. So if it's the Democrats, you vote for the former communists to put them back in power, to punish the Democrats for stealing, for being corrupt. And then when the communists are in power, you vote for them. You vote against them because they're stealing. So what makes Mongolia a democracy is that there is party turnover. It's a very structural, procedural sense. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that suddenly Mongolia works economically and infrastructurally with Russia and China. Now, you would think that a country that is a democracy vis-a-vis its other two neighbors would want nothing to do with these countries. What ends up happening is that they need resources, they need infrastructure, and it makes absolute sense for a country that at this point has maintained a level of neutrality, right? They're not formal members of SCO. They're not formal members of EAEU. They're not formal members of One Belt, One Road, but they are very much in tune with the neighborhood effects that are around them. And in that regard, the agreement that was just reached in Beijing and Tianjin between Mongolia and China, Mongolia and Russia for what we'd call the Siberia 2 project, a major oil and gas line pipeline that goes from Russia through Mongolia into China, tells us everything we need to know. Mongolia is, the sole controller of its own political destiny, but its economic and infrastructural future is within its own neighbors. So I think that was one of the biggest success stories of SCO, is that Mongolia has now been brought further into the fold of many of these countries. But we need to emphasize something. The major players of SCO, they are not, let's say, officially or technically functioning liberal democracies. That does not matter anymore. It really does not matter. What matters is whether or not the state is able to deliver promises of improvements, of progress, modernity, urbanization to its population. And the reality among many of these countries is that if the state is able to do that, if the state is able to provide consumerism, modernity, and industrialization, as you rightly point out, who cares if the country's government is democratic, corporatist, or non-democratic? If you can live as a emerging middle class, this is the one thing that many economists, as far as back as Adam Smith has said, who cares what the government is?
Yeah,
That's the
so
point.
yeah, beautifully put. So, and I would argue that what we have learned is that democracies and autocracies are not opposites that cannot live together, and it's either or. We are on a spectrum. These systems can coexist and did coexist and cooperate very beautifully if they want to. The entire idea that this is a contest between these two is probably the latest outgrowth of Western ideological domination, or the need for ideological domination that then projects your own wish for domination into your political system that even might not work to the extent that you believe it does, but then you map it and say like, okay, this is how it has to run because it needs to be like us. Otherwise, it can't run and it will necessarily produce something bad and something evil. So it's just the latest version of, everybody has to be Christian. You have to be Christian because we are Christians, therefore you need to be Christians. Otherwise, you're evil, right? So it's more that latest version than any kind of inherent contradiction between the ways that states can work together.
Well, I am of the Christian group that believes and absolutely is convinced that Jesus Christ was, before anything else, a Palestinian socialist. He was
and
absolutely. Uh,
and pacifist. The guy was the number one hippie of his time, and he was willing to be nailed to the cross to prove it.
I mean, the most misunderstood people in history are the most popular ones that are constantly quoted. Jesus Christ, Adam Smith, Karl Marx. I mean, all the people that claim to, speak on, their own respective behalves, have a very problematic understanding of them. But you know what? This is interesting because you point to this idea that Europe, specifically Europe at this point, the United States, I am a citizen of the United States, as many know. We've long abrogated this whole idea of making the world better for everybody else. My country is always out for its own interests. But what we see at the beginning of the end of 2025 is that the non-Western, the non-democratic world is providing models of living that are pretty convincing to many in the developing world that one does not have to become a liberal democracy vis-a-vis that of Europe in order to prosper. I need to also emphasize to our viewers, and I think that you and I will agree on this, it doesn't mean that you and I are proponents of authoritarianism. It doesn't mean that we are secretly championing countries that are economically growing, but still have a number of internal social, economic, and human rights problems. That I think that goes without saying here. But the monopoly on what is right in the world, the monopoly on what is effectively a vocation of that of the West in the way that it is. Right? That is ultimately the issue here. What I see following the Shanghai Cooperation Summit, following the Trump-Putin summit in Anchorage, is a group of political elites in Europe that are holding on to this belief, this very peripheral belief that they are still the only people in the world that have the moral authority to talk about what is right. And in the words of Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico, who just came from the Shanghai summit, he noted that many of Europe's leaders are acting as what he calls sulky children. They're reacting. They're not leading, but they're just simply responding in that sense. And, I'm not somebody that acknowledges the rise of the non-West and thinks that this is a great thing, but somebody who looks at the world today, and I look at the SCO summit, and I see Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Narendra Modi, among others. And I see that these are the emerging leaders of the global community. And I look at the leaders, and Pascal, please tell me if you disagree with me on this, but I look at the leaders of Europe, of the individual states like Macron and Merz and Meloni and Starmer. And then I even look at the leaders of the European Union like von der Leyen, among others. And I have to ask, do any of them give any sense of charisma? Do any of them give any kind of inspiration? Or are they nothing more than just mid-level bureaucrats that are just simply responding to how the rest of the world is just working without them? You mentioned very succinctly the one part of the world that was not included in SCO was Europe. And it's not because they weren't invited, but because they regard this as something not them. You say they're not democratic. It's not them. But at this stage of the game, does this really matter at this point? Especially when they're wedded to two beliefs that, rightly or wrongly, seem to be unpopular. Defending Ukraine at all costs, even though at this point, Ukraine is, we haven't talked about Ukraine, but I mean, Ukraine is a losing cause. I wish that it were otherwise, but, it is what it is. And still, as much as they like to talk about human rights violations and the rule of law and everything when it comes to Ukraine, they turn blind eye and deaf ear to what is going on in Gaza and the West Bank. And the world knows this. They see this. They're not stupid. So I have to ask, is there anybody out there that actually looks at the leaders of Europe or Canada, for that matter, and sees them as virtuous paragons of democracy, as antitheses to what we see as emerging in the rest of the world today?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And, the world is seeing through the hubris and is seeing that there's, what is it now, 2 million people in prison in the United States. I mean, the incarcerated population is huge. You see Gaza, you see this new genocide that's being supported by the very forces that claim this moral superiority, and they just don't take it anymore. So I think it's very fair to say that by now we have a moment of more clarity, even if the moment is very brutal. But it is, I would argue, more clarity than we had for many decades, because of the ideological fog that was still simmering around, right? Of how the world works, and we have a larger group of people actually seeing that. The funny thing is, of course, that the minority, the global West, still believes that they're the ones seeing through it, when it's actually the rest that actually that now starts to realize, guys,
Exactly.
you're delusional. And the question to me is how long it will take until a majority in the West gets around and says, like, actually, guys, you're right. That is a bit weird.
I mean, look, I feel that maybe I need to say this just for the sake of clarity, but I think I speak for both of us when I say I'm not happy in saying this. I'm not happy in coming to this realization, right? You and I are both from the West.
Yeah.
We are both from Western countries. And you and I are both looking at all of this and saying our leaders are gaslighting us. Our leaders are wishing that it was still 1995, not 2025. That's the big issue. Within the literature of political science, more specifically international relations, there has been some extensive work done on the um, the different polarities between unipolarity, multipolarity, and bipolarity. Um, John Mearsheimer writes about this. Ken Waltz writes about this. In my opinion, probably the best authority on unipolarity and the dangers of it is Professor Christopher Lane, who has written about this for the past 30 years. I mean, he wrote about this in the 1990s. And you know what Lane, Layne, for your, for our viewers here, he writes about how unipolarity sows the seeds of its own demise. And the worst thing is that if a unipolar power embodies the principles of philosophical liberalism, right? Like the United States, we believe that we are a force for good in the world. We believe that when we intervene, we are doing something for the greater good. When Russia intervenes, it's only for Russia. When Iran or Turkey or China intervenes, it's only for their good. When the United States intervenes, according to this liberalist mindset, we are sacrificing our own interests for the greater good. But it turns out that we're doing it for our own interests anyway, right? Let's be honest. The United States, along with the major European powers, have openly said, and I'm perfectly okay with this. I am absolutely okay with it. They have absolutely said, we will not accept any territorial changes to Ukraine, right? Ukraine's territorial integrity is sacrosanct. Crimea, Donbass, everything is Ukraine. Fine. But then downgrade your embassies in Pristina, Kosovo, to consulates. This is the whole point.
Yeah, that's the thing, and those hypocrisies, those glaring problems in the whole ideological setup and the Speech Act, that's getting clear now, and the others are not buying it anymore, and the others are saying like, fine, we're gonna do our own thing, and we're actually gonna work toward the future and not toward you. And if you ever want to come along, please join. But for now, we're gonna go. And I think that's the hallmark of the multipolar world, that this is now possible.
That is exactly where we are. That is exactly where we are. That is what Russia, China, India, and others have said. It says, okay, this is where we're going. If you want to come along, come along. But this is also the problem of IR liberalism, not domestic liberalism, is that when you are ideologically wedded to a cause, if you suddenly realize, okay, you're right, we're in a multipolar world, you're right, we have to go along with this, you are wedded to a commitment previously that you thought was the only commitment. That's the big problem. That is the big problem that we find with many of these states today. You are committed to an ideology that you put your reputation to. If you suddenly recognize the realities of the world, you throw Ukraine under the bus, just like you threw Serbia under the bus, right?
Yeah.
You throw Israel under the bus. You throw other countries that you have said that our reputation is absolutely committed to. The rest of the world doesn't care about that. The rest of the world says, well, it's not our problem. Right? Not our problem at all. Right? A good example of this is in the immediate aftermath, in the immediate outbreak of the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. I was living in Uzbekistan. Right? I just moved there at the time. And many people were wondering whether Central Asia was going to support or condemn Russia's invasion. Uzbekistan's official response was, not our problem.
Hmm.
We're not getting involved. We're not getting involved. We see
Reasonable. Reasonable.
did.
Very reasonable. Not
We're
their
not
fight.
going, we're not going to intervene one way. It's not our business. It's not our business. You do what you do. If things go one way, great. If they go another way, great. Whatever. We're not getting involved. That's it.
Yeah, yeah. And if we could go further into then into where this mindset is coming from of everybody needs to take sides, but I think we've discussed this in other times, and we will again. Michael Rossi, I would like to encourage everybody to find you on YouTube on your channel. Is there any other outlet where you publish in where people should find you?
So right now, thank you very much for once again promoting my page. My YouTube channel, Michael Rossi Pol Sci, is more than just simply translating with subtitles some primary texts. Every so often, I do have my own lectures online. I also provide some earlier lectures and classes that I taught when I was at Rutgers University. This semester, I am going to be incredibly busy. I will be teaching 7 undergraduate classes at 4 universities. So I might not be as active on YouTube as I can just because I need some time to sleep, eat, and do some laundry. But YouTube is my primary source for information. And I don't know if you want to mention the larger down the road project that you and I are sort of involved in, but sort of eventually this is something that I would like to gravitate towards.
Yes, yes. We call it the Multipolar Peace Network, and there will be more talk about this in the near future. Michael, you're going to be very busy, but I will bother you again to come online here and have a talk. Michael Rossi, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Pascal. Please bother me whenever you want. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you very much.